The story begins with a journey toward a new town. The protagonist, Van, was traveling toward his new home, and along the way, he showed his companions a special ability of his called production magic. Van possessed an incredible power that allowed him to create things out of nothing. However, deep inside his mind, he wished that this magic had some practical use, something that could actually help in battle or survival situations. After a long and exhausting journey, the group finally started approaching the village where they would now live. Van's maid and his closest companion were amazed as they talked about how Van had used his magical power to build a very beautiful mansion in just a few seconds. Just then, Commune ran up to him and said that he would rather live in Van's village than remain in the terrible domain ruled by Lord Jalpa. However, Van did not take his words too seriously because he knew that Commune always sided with him, no matter what. Soon after, Sparta came to Van and explained that the people of the village truly needed a leader who could help solve their everyday problems. Van's words inspired the villagers deeply, and they swore that they would fight until their last breath to protect their village. Van immediately ordered them to move toward the walls and take positions behind the ballista. Kyo informed him that Ortho and his team had gone out hunting, so someone needed to take charge of the situation. Van decided to go up with the other citizens. However, Till grabbed his hand with tears in her eyes, and Van did not want to hurt her feelings. He asked Dee to go up and report the situation to him in real time, while he himself stayed on the ground to give orders. Van then looked toward Commune, who appeared slightly exhausted. With genuine concern and kindness, Van told him not to push himself beyond his limits. If he felt tired, he could simply go back home and rest, and there would be no problem. In his heart, Van thought that if he had asked his brother for help, his brother would certainly have taken care of him. But for Van, that did not really matter. He had already decided that he would spend his entire life together with Commune. Commune, who had been listening to Van's words, was a little surprised. Van promised him that he would always stay by his side, and that he would even risk his life for him if necessary. Hearing this, Van suddenly realized that he might not have fully understood the seriousness of the situation. He became extremely embarrassed and nervously asked whether what he had said sounded like a marriage proposal. The boy answered honestly, and without hesitation, that yes, he loved him. The situation suddenly became a little awkward, and the atmosphere grew heavy. Even so, they decided to continue their journey. As they moved forward, their carriage suddenly came to a violent stop without any warning. The moment the carriage stopped, everyone looked ahead and was shocked by what they saw. The village where they were supposed to live and build their new home was facing serious problems. It was under attack. From a distance, it almost sounded like music was playing, but it was not a celebration. It was a battlefield. Van immediately sprang into action. Without wasting a moment, he gathered all his companions so they could quickly form a strategy and take back control of the village. One of their group members, Den, looked ahead and commented that it appeared to be a group of bandits attacking the village. Van carefully analyzed the situation and noticed that the village was surrounded by archers on all sides. At that moment, an adventurer who had been hired to escort them reminded everyone that they had only been hired to escort the group to the city. They would not accept any mission that put their companions' lives at serious risk. Den, who was a loyal knight, tried to reason with the adventurer. He explained that this village was the first territory under their lord's rule, and that the people living there were under their protection. If they did not draw their swords in a critical moment like this, then when would they ever do it? The adventurer respected Den's strong sense of honor, but replied that such honor applied only to Den. They were simply adventurers, and those ideals did not necessarily apply to them. At that moment, the butler spoke up. He pointed out that if Den died, then what future would remain? Even if they saved the village, it would be meaningless without Den. Then the elderly butler revealed a shocking secret. Despite his old age, he was actually a mage who had mastered the 4 elements. Everyone was stunned because no one had expected the old butler to be so powerful. The butler then explained his plan. First, he would create a magical barrier. After that, the adventurers would attack from behind the barrier using long-range attacks. While the enemy was busy trying to break the barrier, Den and his men would launch coordinated surprise attacks from the flanks. After hearing everyone's ideas, Van offered himself as the bait. However, his maid immediately refused the idea. Commune also volunteered to distract the enemy. Van became emotional and explained that he could not bear to watch someone he loved die in front of him. He told Commune that he had to live a long life because now he was free. Van then decided that he would climb onto the carriage and attack from the front, while the others supported him from the sides with long-range attacks. Although it was extremely dangerous, Van was confident. He explained that he trained every day in swordsmanship with the vice commander of the knights, and that he would not die so easily. The scene then shifted to the adventurers talking among themselves. They admitted that they had never seen a truly good noble before, as most nobles were arrogant. One adventurer asked another why he had accepted this mission. The man replied that he had originally planned to stay for a long time in Marquis Fellatio's territory. Suddenly, Van appeared and thanked them sincerely for accepting the job. After he left, One of the adventurers admitted that perhaps there were some exceptions among nobles after all. Back in the present, the adventurer decided that he would fight on the front line. This time, he would trust his life to Van. Seeing Van hesitate, he said that if a child was willing to risk his life, how could he refuse? His companions agreed. They said they had always mocked the nobility, but they had never met a noble who remembered everyone's names like Van did. Because of that, they could trust him. Den also decided to move forward, believing that protecting Van meant protecting the future of the Marquis family. Esperdata adjusted the strategy. First, the barrier would be created, then long-range attacks would begin. Den would attack from the left side, while Ortho would attack from the right. The battle began. One adventurer was deeply impressed by the butler's magical power. Another commented that if the butler had refused, he himself would have been ready to risk his life. He said that Van was like a big fish in the making, and he would like to see him become a king someday. Soon, the invaders were attacked from behind and began falling one after another. The enemies became confused and tried to react, but Den advanced with his companions and defeated them easily. One fighter attempted to attack the support group and nearly killed a woman. However, Van suddenly appeared and cut off the enemy's leg before calmly finishing the attack. Van warned everyone that there could still be more enemies nearby, so they should remain cautious. After some time, all the enemies were either captured or defeated, and fortunately, no one suffered serious injuries. The mission was successfully completed, and the adventurers received their rewards. After the battle, the adventurers' attitudes toward Van began to change. One adventurer started showing interest in Van and thought that although staying here might not bring much money, he was seriously considering it. One member said he could not stay because he already had a fixed job elsewhere. However, the woman whom Van had saved decided that she would remain there. Gradually, the others also decided to stay. They realized that Van was different from other nobles. Even though he was not yet 10 years old, there was something special about him. They wanted to see what kind of person he would become in the future, so they decided to help him for a while. Later, Van was scolded by his maid, who told him that if he ever risked his life so recklessly again, it would be better if he acted as bait instead of doing something so dangerous himself. Just then, Den arrived and said that the battle had been a great victory. Esperdata noticed that all the villagers had gathered near the gate. When they entered the village, Van introduced himself as the new lord of the village. However, it quickly became clear that the village was in very poor condition. An elderly man stepped forward who turned out to be the village chief. He thanked them sincerely for saving the village. Van asked whether such attacks had happened before. The chief confirmed that the village had been attacked several times just within the current year. Van was surprised that the village was being targeted so frequently. The chief explained that during Count Ferdinand's time, there used to be an order of knights that regularly patrolled the region, but that system no longer existed. Van realized that ever since new authorities had taken control of the area, the village had been left vulnerable. He felt regret over his father's actions and understood that nobles did not consider this village a priority because it produced very little tax revenue. Van then told the chief that simply complaining about the kingdom's condition would not solve anything. Instead of just complaining, they needed to take action. He suggested 3 possible solutions. First, they could make the village so valuable that the kingdom could no longer ignore it. Second, they could earn constant money to hire mercenaries. Third, they could develop the village themselves. One villager said they had tried before, but it was not easy. Van replied that he understood the difficulties, but now he was their lord and he would never allow his people to starve. Even so, many villagers still had little hope. At that moment, Esperdata stepped forward and announced that he had once been the head butler of Marquis Furcio's household. He explained that Van was an extremely talented young man who had been appointed a lord at only 8 years old. He called Van a prodigy and also declared that Den would now serve as the village guard. Hearing this filled the villagers with hope. One man asked whether Van could also master the 4 elements. Van humbly replied that they should not have exaggerated expectations about his magic, and that he would help them in other ways as well. Another resident asked about taxes, which were currently set at 30%. Van decided that for the time being, the tax would be reduced to only 10%. Hearing this, the villagers cheered with happiness. For Van, the most important thing was stabilizing the lives of the people. Van's first step was to reinforce the village walls. He asked whether anyone could help. One man said he could use earth magic, but the result would only be temporary. Van replied that, for now, that would be good enough. The man used his magic, and everyone was impressed by his power. Van then decided to test his production magic. He created an object and checked its durability. An adventurer tried to break it with his sword, but failed. Everyone was shocked. That night, a girl asked whether Van's magic ever ran out. Van explained that he did not feel any limit. Normally, production magic required enormous power, and even creating a single item was extremely difficult. The next day, Van decided to build a house. He also wanted to organize a harvest festival in the future. He wondered whether he could truly build an entire house with his magic, but the moment he imagined it, he used his power and quickly constructed a large house. Everyone was stunned by his ability. In this way, Van not only defeated the enemies but also won the hearts of the villagers and laid the foundation for a new beginning through his magic. The villagers were amazed and applauded with joy, believing that with Van's help, their lives could finally become better. Sparta also believed that Van was the best possible leader for them. D and Ortho agreed with this opinion. D followed Van's orders and ran toward the wall. After seeing the situation ahead, he reported to Van that nearly 40 armored attackers were approaching. The adventurers and warriors were still astonished by how Van had created an entire house out of thin air. Van reassured them not to worry, because he could build houses for everyone. They just needed to gather enough wood for him. Hearing this excited the brave adventurers and knights so much that they turned it into a competition to gather materials. Soon Rondo and several other villagers approached Van and requested that he build houses for them as well. When Van inspected their current homes, he discovered that most of them were in terrible condition. Even though he knew that it would exhaust him, he still decided to help and promised to build a new house for every villager. The moment the villagers heard this promise, they began celebrating with joy, realizing that they were all going to receive brand new homes and a completely new start in life. Van feels happy seeing that the production magic, which many people used to look down on, is now bringing smiles to people's faces. Without wasting any time, Van immediately begins working. Using his magic, he starts repairing every house in the village, rebuilding them again and again until they look completely new. Van explains to everyone that he purposely made all the houses look the same so that there would be no discrimination between villagers. For now, he says, this is more than enough, but in the future, he plans to create houses that will be customized according to each person's needs. The villagers are extremely happy and deeply grateful to Van, because they are finally witnessing real change in their poor and struggling village. After finishing that task, Van decides to put everything else aside for a while and build a simple public bathhouse next to his mansion where people can bathe. When the bathhouse is finally completed, the villagers become very excited and curious. In truth, Van originally built the bathhouse mainly for himself, but he feels happy when he sees how much the villagers like it. Of course, he did not build it entirely alone. Commune and Plural also helped him during the construction. Later that night, Van finally gets a chance to spend some peaceful time inside the bathhouse with Commune. After Commune steps out of the water, Van notices something surprising. Commune has developed quite a lot of muscles. Seeing this makes Van a little jealous. Commune calmly says that compared to D, he is still quite skinny. Just at that moment, D and his friends suddenly enter the bathhouse without any clothes and casually suggest that everyone should bathe together. Van instantly realizes that this is probably a signal for him to leave. However, before he can escape, D grabs him and pulls him back. After spending several long and awkward hours in that strange situation, Van finally manages to return to his bedroom. As he lies down on his soft bed, he feels calm, relaxed, and satisfied. The next day, Van is pleased to see that the knights and adventurers have worked extremely hard to dig a deep trench around the village. However, the trench still lacks water, so it cannot yet function as a proper moat. Van comes up with a new plan. In his plan, Sparta will use his magic to create a large trench and redirect water from a nearby river. Meanwhile, D and the others will continue digging the trench manually to extend it further. Van himself will use his magic to reinforce the structure of the trench. As the work progresses, Van becomes slightly irritated because D seems to be enjoying the digging far more than necessary. Van originally estimated that digging the trench would take about a week, but by sunset D and the others had already dug so far that the path to the neighboring village had become visible. By the following day, the canal system designed to bring water into the trench is finally completed. When the gate is opened, everyone watches in amazement as water begins flowing through the canal and fills the trench. Soon, the entire village becomes surrounded by a moat filled with water. After seeing this success, Van decides that it would be wiser to create a lake behind the village so that excess water during heavy rains does not overflow and cause problems. Once the lake is completed, the villagers celebrate happily because they now know they will never have to worry about water shortages again. Meanwhile, deep inside the forest, a woman named Panamera is seen traveling toward a remote village with a girl named Art. Art seems to trust Panamera completely. Back in the village, Van continues working tirelessly. Using his magic, he constructs a massive defensive wall around the settlement. To further strengthen the village's defenses, he installs long-range weapons, such as ballista shooters along the walls, so that enemies can be attacked from a distance. The villagers are stunned to see how their small and weak village has suddenly transformed into a well-fortified stronghold. D begins thinking that if Lord Jalpa had known how powerful Van truly was, he would never have exiled him. However, Sparta disagrees and says that Lord Jalpa would probably have still driven Van away, because his abilities are not suited for direct combat or large-scale warfare. The two of them continue arguing until Van eventually stops them and tells them that instead of worrying about the past, they should focus on using everything they currently have and fight with their full strength. A few hours later, Till prepares a delicious lunch for Van. During the meal, Esperta brings up an important issue. The village needs a stable source of income. Van begins thinking about what the village could produce or sell, but unfortunately, none of the ideas that come to his mind seem very promising. The next day, Van suggests that Till and Commune should test some newly created weapons. When Commune swings his sword against a shield made from orc material, the sword cuts straight through the shield. Zara, who crafted the shield, begins crying in disappointment. Van quickly uses his magic to repair the shield, which makes Zara happy again. At that moment, Ortho arrives pulling a cart filled with minerals. Van processes the iron ore and turns it into iron, then forges a beautiful sword for Zara. The sword created by Van is so impressive that the other adventurers immediately start asking for swords as well. While examining the minerals, Esparta notices something unusual. Among the minerals is mithril, a rare metal that should not normally be found in that forest. This discovery leads them to believe that there might be a dungeon nearby. Van realizes that discovering a new dungeon could make the village famous. However, he also understands that if the guild or the kingdom learns about it, they will likely interfere and might even send Van somewhere else. Plural suggests that before announcing the discovery of the dungeon, Van should first focus on developing the village further so that outside forces will find it difficult to interfere. Soon after, a serious threat appears. Several giant armored lizards begin approaching the village. Each of them is nearly 8 meters long. D becomes nervous because even a group of experienced knights often struggles to defeat a single armored lizard, and their village only has a handful of trained fighters. Van calmly orders D to load iron arrows into the giant crossbows. D immediately rushes to follow the command. The knights warn him that the thick skin of armored lizards cannot be pierced by normal weapons. D hands over command to Van. Van orders everyone to load the ballistas and fire. As the arrows strike the lizards, something of that income must be paid as tax to the Marquise. Van asks whether there is any way to avoid paying such heavy taxes. Esparta replies that it would be impossible to hide the sale of such a large amount of goods. After thinking for a moment, Esparta comes up with a solution. He suggests that instead Mira laughs and says that Count Fernando believes Marquise Jal planned to conquer their territory. However, Mira adds that according to what she heard, Van was actually sent here because he lacks elemental magic. Van tells her the truth. He admits that she is correct about the elemental magic part, but he was not sent here to lead any military campaign. Mira refuses to believe this explanation and claims that Van was sent here with 5,000 soldiers in order to transform the village into a military base. Hearing this, Van bursts out laughing and explains that he was expelled from his family home with nothing but his personal belongings. Deputy Knight Commander present in the village are just illusions. D replies that he came voluntarily to complete Van's training. Esparta also explains that he has already clearly demonstrated the reason behind the village's rapid development. Van decides to give his guests a demonstration. He takes them. Mira is already immediately after that. Van uses his own magic to transform the earth wall into solid concrete and then creates a gate and asks Van about his magical ability. Van calmly answers that he uses production magic, which is widely considered the worst type of magic, and that is precisely why he was exiled to this place. Mira then tells Van that she was actually sent there to offer Art's hand, though wishes to marry his daughter to Van, so that Van will not attempt to conquer their territory. Van responds that such a marriage is unnecessary because he has no intention of fighting or conquering anyone. Mira admits that at first she wanted to stop Art from being engaged to the ruler of a small and unknown village, but after seeing Van's abilities and character, she now seriously thought about marriage yet. Van kindly tells her that she can take as much time as she needs. Mira then says that they will be staying in the village for the night. She asks whether there is an extra room available in the mansion, but Van decides instead to build a small inn for them to stay in. After dinner, Art tells Van that she likes cute things such as few wishes.